Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be going through the 3 steps to sharpen your images using Lightroom and also using Photoshop. So, we all know when it comes to focusing on the eyes, focusing on our subject, sometimes we don't necessarily nail it, right? But we might love a shot. Like for instance, this one here, the couple picked out, they loved this shot, but the eyes just aren't quite that sharp. And really just the face overall. I shot this pretty wide open, shot it on a digital uh, DSLR camera, so the focus wasn't, dialed in perfectly. So in order to fix this kind of image, I want to take it further, sharpen it, and fix some of those issues. So today we're going to be going through how to do that, right? So here's my original shot, and here's the final image. Maybe a little bit too sharp overall, but you can kind of see how I can bring out a lot of those details in the face. Brighten up the eyes, of course. There's a little bit of dodging and burning and editing going on there as well. But you can see mostly in the hair as well as in the eyes how I'm focusing on that sharpness. So let's jump right in. So step number 1 is going to be pre-sharpening in Lightroom. So using the details panel, sliders keep it simple. That's step 1. Step 2, we're going to be using local adjustments, more specifically the adjustment brush. So that way when we're adding in our sharpness on the image, we can brush away the background or any areas we don't want that sharpness being applied, right? Because when you're using a slider, it's the entire image. So we can brush away some of the background so it's not as sharp as the subject. But what we can also do is add even more sharpening in Lightroom once we apply um, an adjustment brush. We can increase that sharpness on the face, more specifically on the eyes, hair, and teeth of our subject. Step 3 is going to be using Photoshop to apply some output sharpening. So output sharpening is very important when you're resizing your image or when you're ready to export it to maybe the web or to print or different avenues for exporting or outputting your file. So output sharpening is very important. We can also use masking actions. We'll go through how to save an action in Photoshop so you can make this process even faster next time. So let's dive into step number 1, which is the pre-sharpen in Lightroom. All right, so step number 1 is going to be using the details panel in Lightroom to do some pre-sharpening. Now, you might be thinking with an image like this that we can fix it with the presence panel. The presence panel has texture and clarity, which work pretty good for adding some, sharpness to the image, but it doesn't necessarily fix these issues we're running into. As you notice here, it really starts to make the skin look quite bad with its sharpening technique. It's definitely not something that I'm going to want to apply to get sharpness like this. So in order to do that, I need to jump down to my details panel. But I think it's important to see those tools differently than the sharpening tools. So first thing you want to do is make sure you're zoomed in at 100%, which I've done here. And I kind of like to isolate my panel just so I can see the image in full as well as my sliders here. So if I hold Option, I can actually toggle this image from color to black and white so I can see how much sharpness I'm applying. This kind of helps dial in our settings. So once I get to about 110, I'm pretty happy with the way this image looks. Just with that adjustment alone, it adds enough of that sharpness where it's not over the top, but it really starts to bring my image back to life. Now I can do the same thing with radius. If I take that all the way down while holding Option and then start dragging to the right, you'll see details start to come in. It's very important to kind of stop once those details become a little more prominent in the image, and then we can kind of see here on and off what that's doing for our image. So the radius is going to be looking at the edge details and bringing that out. Now detail is going to be another enhancement of that, but it's also going to be kind of more of like a texture you're applying to the image as well. So detail, if we take all the way to the right, you can really see it amplified. Now, if I turn radius up, I think a little bit further, you can really see the difference in detail. This might help a little bit more. As we take that to the right, you can really see that kind of come out in the hair. And that's just way too much sharpening, way too much. So resetting those two, setting radius back to about 1.8, so felt pretty happy about. And then details, I can turn that up to about 40. I think that that's fine. So you can see our image here toggled on and off. Looks pretty good. And now masking is a really interesting tool. So if you want to apply a quicker way for masking on your image and you just want those, say, the edges of the image to be sharp or just those fine details, you can do that. So this actually allows us to only sharpen the very specific part of the images that we want. So white's going to be where the effect is applied, black is going to be where it's masked out. So it's definitely an interesting effect. If I, honestly, what I usually do is I apply it to the entire image. I usually don't put masking on at all. If I want to mask out parts of the image, I'll do that with the local adjustment brush, which we're ready to jump into next. For step number 2, it's going to be masking in and out areas for sharpness. All right, so step number 2 is going to be using the adjustment brush to mask in and out some of that sharpness. So to get to the adjustment brush, we can click the K key to jump right in. So as you can see, I already have some settings here for sharpness. I also like to add some other kind of contrast or more density style adjustments to add a little more depth to my image. So if I'm going to go in here and I want to apply sharpness, I'm just going to apply it to her face. So with my brush open here, I literally can just start clicking away, click and dragging, and it will sharpen all these areas on her face. I don't have auto mask turned on or anything like that, which is fine, but I think just to kind of show our mask here, I can toggle that on and off by hitting the O key, and we can see how much sharpness that brings in there. I think it's a little extreme, especially on the whites and blacks here and the contrast. Probably a good idea to maybe dial that back just a little bit. I don't want to add um, too much enhancements on the tonal side, but at least we can kind of see some of that sharpness come out. Now if I want to add another new brush and say I want to dodge her eyes, I can quickly do that as well. So if I just kind of come in here, just do a real quick adjustment so that way we can have a little bit cleaner exposure on the eyes, nothing too crazy. Maybe even add another one, add some more over here. Right? So just subtle changes to bring in some things for kind of brighten those eyes out, and maybe even with the lips and teeth as well. Just little things, but we don't need to get into the more heavy-handed editing in that. Just want to kind of show the masking and things. So here's what's really important as well. If I want to remove some of that um, sharpening that we applied with the details panel to the entire image, what I can do is I can reset my panel here and take the sharpness down to like -50, and I can paint in all those areas that I want to remove it. So if I want to remove that sharpening effect that we applied, kind of helps to turn the mask on as well. But if I want to remove all of that from my image, I can. So that way it's not being applied. I think we would probably want it to be applied. Turn the flow up to 100 on the veil. So we'll keep that, of course. And on the arm. So that way we can quickly just kind of remove that effect from areas in the background. So to kind of show you what that effect is doing, very subtle, but that way it doesn't sharpen too much in the background here. So I want to remove the pins so we can kind of see. Let's see, we'll do those on auto so that way we can kind of see the image. These are probably a little heavy-handed, so we can probably bring that down just a little bit. So those don't look so over-processed. So that's the quick process that I would use for the masking out in Lightroom more specifically. So let's take this image into Photoshop and really enhance those details. All right, so step number 3 is going to be editing in Photoshop to apply our output sharpening. So output sharpening comes into play when you've already resized your image, you've done the cropping, this image is ready to go to print, to web, or some other place that you want to export or render this file to. So first thing we want to do before going into Photoshop is we want to check our Lightroom settings to make sure under the external editing our file format, color space, bit depth, resolution, all that stuff is correct before we go into Photoshop. These are the settings that I use. You can use whichever you want, but this tends to be the most universal for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click off an X, hold Command, and hit the E key for to take this file and immediately create a TIFF copy of it with the Lightroom adjustments already applied, and it opens it up into Photoshop. And the reason why I use the edit in feature is because it will save my image back into the Lightroom catalog, gives me that organization, which I love in Lightroom. So first things first, what we want to do is we want to create an action. Because anytime we're doing something in Photoshop that we're going to be doing repeatedly in the future, if I could type here, the best thing to do is to create an action to speed that up and be able to batch apply it to multiple images at once. So go ahead and click on output sharpening here, rename that. We click on record. We can start building our output sharpening action. So first thing I want to do is duplicate the base layer, which is 101 for Photoshop. You definitely want to work non-destructively. Duplicating the base layer is the best way to do that. You never want to work on that background layer. So go ahead and click on OK. And now I'm going to double click on this to change the layer styles. So this is my favorite way to change blending modes, to change opacity when I'm building an action, so that way everything's a bit more organized under my action drop down here. So going down further, I'm going to change the blend if this layer, take that to, let's see, 240, nope, all the way down to 230 actually. And take this down to 250. And the underlying layer I'm going to take to 20 and 10. So now I'm ready to apply a high pass filter to this. So we'll go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. And if we click on our eye, we can see that the high pass has been applied here, which is the base for our sharpening. If I take this all the way to the left, then slowly start dragging it to the right, you'll see those details come in, right? So I'm going to leave mine at 2.5. I think that that's fine. For this image here, go ahead and click OK. And now that I've done that, I'm done with my action and output sharpening. So I can click the stop key, and it saved that action. Now, if I go ahead and just click on output sharpening here, click play, it automatically applies all of those settings specifically for high pass. Well, if I want to change that, all I have to do is turn on this dialog box here. So it'll do my make layer, it'll do my set current layer. See, all this stuff's important. That's the reason why I do it in the layer styles. But now that I have this dialog box, it's going to ask me what settings I want, which is pretty useful when you're going image to image. You want to turn that off, of course, if you're batch applying this to multiple images. You don't want that popping up every time. It's definitely important to understand the difference. But when I click play, now it's going to give me the ability to change those settings. So it becomes a super useful tool in Photoshop. So go ahead and click OK. I'm going to keep it turned on for now. I think that that's fine. We'll zoom into our image and we'll see what we think. So keep in mind, this is being applied to the entire image. So if we just want this to be applied to a particular part of our image, say the eyes and the teeth only, because we feel like the skin's getting pretty heavy in texture, looking almost over sharpened, we can hold Option, click on the masking tool, click the B key for brush. You can actually hit enter here. It'll get you to the opacity. Of course, if you're, I'm just using my laptop here, I don't have a Wacom tablet or something with pressure sensitivity. So go ahead and click on 100 for opacity. My foreground color is white, so that means it's going to paint on this effect wherever I click and drag my mouse. So if I quickly do that, you can see that it's applying it on the eyes. Now, if I wanted to get rid of this, see if I can, and immediately I can hold Option and click Delete, and that gets rid of everything in the mask itself. There's nothing being applied. So if you want to see what your mask is, if you hit the backslash key here, not really the most attractive looking way to do it, but here's how you can see with your mask on and off. So holding Option, I can get rid of that mask and it goes away entirely. Now, if I want to toggle between these blending layers, you can see the difference between overlay and soft light's pretty subtle, but hard light gets pretty extreme. So I'm going to keep mine on overlay. If I want to increase that, I can always take my opacity up. That's the flexibility of that tool. Or what I can do is, we can mask in different areas. I can mask out different areas. So if I don't want as much on her hair, but I'm fine with the texture on the face, or if I want to build it up, it's pretty useful way to do it. I can hold Command and hit I. That will toggle that. I can do a 25 to the entire image, right? So all areas of her face would be getting 25%. Then I can apply another 25% to the eyes, another 25% to the teeth. And I can do that, increase that again. I mean, you can kind of build that up to whatever you want it to be, so that way only the skin gets a little bit of sharpening and things like that. You have different techniques to kind of add in. If I want to add another 25% to the hair, I can. Of course, you can separate the hair from the eyes and the teeth, but that's kind of a more simple way to kind of build up some of that sharpening as well. But that's basically it. We could apply, increase the opacity here, on and off. And so once I'm done with my image, all I have to do is hit save, and I can quit Photoshop, and it's automatically going to pop up in my Lightroom catalog. So if I go in here, my last TIFF is here. Right, so here's kind of where we ended, and here's where we're at here. So my original image here, we can kind of zoom in here, zoom in a little bit further. Let's just zoom in over the face. Is it? Let's see here, where 100%. There we go. Take this to the middle, kind of see very subtle before and after. Of course, we didn't do anything too extreme, but as we saw here in my original image, we can kind of see how much cleaner this portrait can get. Of course, with a little more work as well, the sharpening. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the edits, and now let's talk about the results. All right, so now that you have the tools to save an image like mine that had a little bit of soft focus in it, hopefully this helps you, salvage some images, but also stay organized, right? Because when using Lightroom and Photoshop, it's really important to stay organized, have all of your images saved in one place for easier access. As well as using Lightroom and Photoshop, working non-destructively is so important with sharpening. So that way, when you export for print, you might sharpen differently than you would for web. So you don't want that to be sandwiched onto your image to where you couldn't make those adjustments later. So having that output layer in Photoshop becomes so helpful to be able to change the opacity and adjustments, or just remove it and start the process over. Same goes for Lightroom. So, starting out with the input sharpening, I always recommend doing that in the raw processing program. So whether you're using Lightroom or not, input sharpening has become quite easy in Lightroom to use. You can do a process in Photoshop, but I find it to be a little tedious, and especially since you're working on the raw file, it's better to be doing that input sharpening there. And of course, if you're doing noise reduction, you always want to reduce the noise first, then you sharpen. This isn't really about noise reduction, so to speak, but that's something to keep in mind too when it comes to that details panel. Should you do noise reduction first, after? Of course it should be first. Um, but jumping into using masking tools, whether it's in Lightroom or Photoshop, it's so important if you want to remove that mask off of your, remove the effect off of specific areas of the image. Masking is essential as well. So looking at in Lightroom with the pins versus with the layers and layer masks in Photoshop, I mean, you definitely have the flexibility to do that. And above all, details matter, right? So you should be sharpening the right way. You should be taking your pictures to the next level, right? So don't give up on an image if it's slightly soft or off in any ways. You can definitely do a lot of give your images a lot of love in post-production to kind of get them to that level. So hope you guys learned something. Reach out to me and tune in for next month.